Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Marianne Pernia of the Museum of Contemporary Art and Design. Welcome to the reading, But for the Lovers with Gina Apostol and Charlson Ong. This is the first of the series of talks presented by the Museum of Contemporary Art and Design and publishing house Exploding Galaxies on the first Philippine edition of Wilfrido D. Nolledo's But for the Lovers under the program MCAD TK. MCAD TK takes its name from a publishing term that means to come. Found in manuscripts and drafts, the placeholder text should be replaced before publication goes to print. TK is a state of figuring things out, of changing one's mind, of moving on, while plotting one's return. In the same spirit, MCAD TK revisits the life of ideas as produced and disseminated in books and other texts. In reading and rereading, which we're going to do in the series of talks, one finds renewed understanding. To speak about MCAD's partner for this series of talks, Exploding Galaxies, we would like to call on Mara Coson.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for being here on a Friday afternoon. I just wanted to share a few words about Exploding Galaxies. We're a very new press, so I kind of wanted to give a bit of an introduction. So Exploding Galaxies is a press that focuses on out-of-print Filipino fiction, starting with, of course, Wilfrido D. Nolledo's But for the Lovers. And we plan to continue to keep publishing around several books a year of the books that we consider among the best lost classics. So I really hope that maybe as we go along, this is our first of 3 talks that we continue to see, hopefully. And yeah, if you enjoy But for the Lovers, it would be really great if you could, like maybe tell your friends or let us know actually what your thoughts are, follow our newsletter. It'll be really great for us to hear from everyone. If you have recommendations, for example, we'd also love to hear that. What's really good about today also is I'm really thankful to have Gina Apostol and Charlson Ong here with us today. But for the Lovers, it's a masterpiece, and for that reason, sometimes it can be quite challenging to read. But when after I first read But for the Lovers, and then I asked Gina Apostol, I'd be honored if she could write a foreword, and when she did, and I reread But for the Lovers again, it enlightened me a lot, especially as the more complicated sections of the text. So it's really great for her to be here today with us so that she can take us through it in conversation with Charlson Ong as well. So yeah, thank you guys so much. And there's the books are actually on special today. So please on your way out, pick up a book. It'll be really great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mara. We'd like to introduce now the 2 writers whose conversation we'll be listening in this afternoon. Gina Apostol's La Tercera, published this May, has been described as her most ambitious, personal, and encompassing novel. A story about what seems impossible, capturing the truth of the past, and the terrible cost to a family or a country that fails to try. Her 4th novel, Insurrecto, was named by Publishers Weekly one of the 10 books of 2018 and selected as an editor's choice of the NYT. Her essays and stories have appeared in the New York Times, Los Angeles Review of Books, Foreign Policy, Gettysburg Review, Massachusetts Review, and others. She lives in New York City, in Western Massachusetts, and grew up in Tacloban later. Gina joins us from Rome. Thank you very much for joining us. And we have on site Mr. Charlson Ong. He's a multi-awarded fictionist who has published 4 collections of short fiction, Men of the East and Other Stories, Woman of Amcao and Other Stories, Conversion and Other Fictions, and Of That Other Country We Now Speak and Other Stories, as well as 4 novels, An Embarrassment of Riches, Banyaga, A Song of War, Blue Angel, White Shadow, and White Lady, Black Christ. He teaches creative writing at the University of the Philippines and is an associate of the UP Institute of Creative Writing. He is a board member of the Philippine chapter of the International PEN, Poets, Essayists, and Novelists. Everyone, Ms. Gina Apostol and Mr. Charlson Ong. Thank you.
So Gina, are you?
Good, good.
Yeah.
How are you?
Well, Gina and I
sorry.
are old friends. No?
Yeah. So sorry
we,
not to be there on the couch there. That would have
we
been
go
fun.
back a long way.
Mhm.
And I think a long time ago we were in Palawan together. Yeah. So anyway, actually I was hoping there will be older people here, so that people who might have read the book or read Nolledo in the past, encountered him or even knew him personally. But it seems puro bata. No? Because he's actually an older generation than us. No? Ibang generasyon yan. And but even then, I think as Gina has written in his intro, he was influential. No? A lot of young people. Siguro ang mas ka-generation na sila Crip Yuson, sila Sawi, Aquino. Who also maybe are right in a mode na pareho. Ako, I would say that I first read the book a long time ago. Maybe, I don't know how long ago. I have the older edition. And maybe I didn't even finish it. At some point I thought, there's a lot of fireworks here. I'm not sure where it's going. And so I had to reread it. And I think it's a sort of book that ages well, like wine. And when you go back to it, I think you find something else. That it's a sort of book you reread, and then it's different. Parang like jazz, you wouldn't like it maybe at first. There's really nothing too familiar, and then you just catch on to it. But anyway, I think kasi Gina would like to read some excerpts from her introduction, which I think maybe they haven't read anyway.
Okay, so I was asked to read from the introduction. I'm just going to read some parts of it, not all. I mean, so I started off with something similar to what Charlson just said. I just want to say also thank you for having me. Thanks everyone for coming to this event for a writer. I think in the Philippines, coming for events for writers are always has always been for me just a mark of humanity that I always appreciate. So thanks for being here and thanks for having me. So I'm going to read a section going along with what Charlson just said. So it starts with this. I'm not exactly sure how many times I've read Nolledo's But for the Lovers. My dim recall of teenage days is the days of books indiscriminately devoured. My early memory of coming across Nolledo's novel, somehow maybe in Diliman, very likely from the library because I have no trace of any old Manila copy on my shelves, is simply the shock of discovery. Very likely my reading of it was extracurricular. It did not come up in my Philippine Lit before 1950s class, of course, because it was published in 1970. And like Charlson, I would say, I mentioned here, I don't believe I understood the book. I remember having juvenile critical clause out as if in self-defense. In my memory, I begrudged what I thought was its allegory. In that immature way, a young reader thinks a jaundiced eye is important. But the fact is, my recall is hazy because for a kid like me, and I wrote this novel called Bibliolepsy, which is all about reading and all about being full of words. For a kid like me to read this book is to fall in love with it. This book, in my memory of that first time, was about words. What Charlson was saying, the play with words, the sheer romance with words. Nolledo has this in abundance. And when I was writing this forward, I just opened a page at random. And I saw neologism, a geographic joke, consonants, slant rhymes, all in one paragraph. So it's a fever dream of language play. That is the way it opened for me. And that type of book for me as a kid was matched to kindling. And so I had this hazy notion of how much I loved it. I know I came across the book again when I returned to America in the 90s. When I came to America in the 90s, because I had a copy, and I still have a copy of the Dalkey edition, you know, the re-edition of it with Robert Cooper's intro. And I've reread that several times in the past few decades. The last time being when a magazine asked me to write an essay on the question, what book do you always recommend? And the book I always recommend is But for the Lovers. And I do a reading of it here. It's flawless in its use of free and direct discourse as a weapon of national memory. Free and direct discourse is a particular narration mode, which I'm sure many of you here know about if you've been in writing programs, but it's third person within an omniscient frame. And it's a very difficult form, you know, to get flawless. So the use of free and direct discourse in this novel, I found as a novelist amazing. And it's used as a weapon of national memory, set in Japanese-occupied Manila during World War II. Written with delirium's precision. I'm going to jump ahead and talk about this question I had about what does it mean to write. What I was thinking when I wrote the foreword, and I went back to an essay that I had written about But for the Lovers before Mara had asked me to write this foreword. That concept of what is it really to say of a novel that its delirium is precise? What do words like absolute mastery of voice stand up over the years? And why did I feel discomfort over the concept of a cult masterpiece? I reread the novel, therefore, one more time. And that time that I reread it now not only as a reader, but also as a novelist. And being the novelist that I am now, I also reread it as a woman. So I read it as if I would reread any of my novels before publication, testing it for error. You know, when you have to reread your novel so many different times, you know, for the editor, for the copy editor, et cetera, and you're always looking for error. Testing it for error, testing its diction for irrelevant word, testing its syntax for possible rearrangement, testing its sentences rhythm, testing its scenes for detail a narrative moment might not need, testing its narrative arc for cracks where the design breaks or whether the invisible trajectory of time, which is the novelist's structural secret, ever loses you. But page after page, and this is what I said in the foreword, But for the Lovers never lost me. And I think that's pretty remarkable. The book is a marvel. It cuts no corners. It knows its purpose. Like the best of our Filipino novels, like Noli Me Tangere, it is sui generis. It comes seemingly from nowhere to speak an experience of trauma, unspeakably Filipino. It marks its ambition by its existence. Line after line, page after page for me. It was also sheer fun to read. Rereading it every day, I took the book up with an almost giddy, comforted pleasure. The comfort of reading a book that does exactly what its imagination requires and its truth demands. I think the conversation that Charlson and I are going to have might bring up other aspects of the foreword. I'm not going to go into the plot of the book. It's set in World War II. It's more or less centered on the days before the Battle of Manila in 1945. So, Charlson, do you have any questions or?
Nabanggit mo no that in your forward, if I'm correct, that you are not too comfortable no with it being tagged as cult no. Mm-hmm. And that in fact the late national artist Bien Lumbera also commented no somewhere na the book, which sort of cemented the Nolledo's cult following, as it were, also made him inaccessible or far less accessible to a larger readership. No? But then again, I don't know if it can be avoided. No? The way he writes or the language itself would appeal to readers who luxuriate in the sounds and rhythms and the cadences that he uses, no? Or it's like a drunken master in a way, no, pag binasa mo.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's okay. That would be one of the reasons why I would go against the concept of cult. It's for me, it's a received idea about the novel before one has actually read the novel. And I think all of our novels deserve the generosity towards the writer, towards the book, that it deserves the generosity of actually reading it carefully. And so my problem with the concept of cult masterpiece, however, is a backhanded compliment in some ways, because you already have a received idea of a seeming narrow range of the book. I think we owe ourselves as Filipinos that generosity towards the Filipino writer to read him or her for what he or she is doing. Okay, I'm here in Italy. I'm in Rome, and a few only 20 minutes away is the grave of Gramsci. So he's the founder of Italy's Communist Party, Gramsci. And for me, it's really interesting that in one of his essays, so he was a writer also, in one of his essays on education, he maintained that, especially for the Italian worker, for instance, workers should be taught to read Dante. You know, this is the Communist Party founder. It's kind of weird because of the complexity of Dante. But his point was that no one, including workers and the general populace of a nation, should be alienated from the cultural production that their own world has produced. And that would be my response against the concept of reading that the question of cult or English, etc., or pop versus jazz assumes. What we should do as Filipinos is strive to make as many people as possible able to read Nolledo with pleasure. Since his English is also part of our lives, the work of history in the novel is, for me, it's the way he moves his contemporary times, you know, Philippines in the 1940s and 50s, into the past in the seamless way. It's so much part. I mean, he's an important part of our reading of our history and of ourselves. And so since his English is also part of our lives, we need to keep moving into the direction of having a nation of radical justice that will allow all of us Filipinos to read the complexity of ourselves in our novels, in whatever language we find our novels. So for me, the received idea of cult, even imagining that only a few people would enjoy this kind of English, I think we are limiting ourselves and our imagination for our fellow Filipinos. So if we can have a nation in which even the worker can understand Nolledo, we'd be good. Because it's so important for us to know the possibilities of our art, all of us, to read our art. We can't give up hope on the Filipino reader, narrowing this to cult, etc. However limited that range currently might be in terms of our political exigencies, we need to keep expanding our possibilities of reading and art. And that's why, for me, when Mara said that she was republishing this novel and asked me to do the foreword, I thought this kind of work, this kind of publishing is so important to us. We cannot forget our writers, because when we forget our writers, we're also forgetting our history. We're forgetting our legacies when they're not in print and when they're not being read. And I would always go with the possibility, but the radical possibility of everyone being able one day to read Nolledo with the care that a teacher might, a writer might.
Yeah, okay. So, kung ano, in fact, I sort of suggested to Mara na an audiobook might be good, no? To hear how it sounds. No? It's sort of a book that It's very oral. No? Would you imagine this book being translated, let's say, into Filipino or Cebuano or Waray? You know? Would it sound? How would it sound?
I think anything, you know, any book, as we know, we've read, like we read a lot of the books that we've loved in translation. You know, we've read Kafka, who wrote in German. We've read Dostoevsky, who wrote in Russian. So many. I think any book with care can be translated into another language. I don't know what might be behind the question, Charlson. You know, I do recognize that, you know, for me as a novelist, I think a lot about language. What does it mean for me, for instance, to write in English when in fact the tongue of my mother is Waray, you know? So what does it mean for us that here we are speaking in English when our different tongues, what is most primal for us, the language most primal for us might be another. So I don't know what's behind the question, but the concept of translation, I think, is simply a part, I think, of our reading lives, of our even ordinary everyday lives, where we'd be. I'm always translating or somehow thinking about what when I'm speaking in English or trying to explain something, that Waray Tagalog will always come in. And to be honest, in Nolledo's novels, very interesting. When I reread the novel recently, I was really fascinated by its very seamless uses of Tagalog and Spanish and all the different, and even the kind of seemingly dialect of English that the American pilot has in the book. It's very Midwestern, the English that he uses for the American pilot, and then he just sprinkles in the Tagalog, you know, the way Rizal also did. Filibusterismo, for instance, which begins with a joke on the name of the boat that Simon, etc., are riding in. The boat is named Tabo, which is a funny name for a Filipino boat, because it's, for the Spanish, it would be different. I mean, it's a book written in Spanish, Tabo. We know as a Tagalog that that is a joke on on the ship. You know, the name is a pun. It's a bilingual pun in some ways. So I think it could be. It would be up to the translator to understand well how to move it into the Waray space, into the Cebuano space, etc. But I'm not a translator myself. I don't know if behind the question is the fact that it is so beautifully crafted in English, and you'd have to have that. You'd have to have that similar attention to Waray or to Cebuano that Nolledo gave to English.
Are there questions from the audience? Wala na kaming pag-usapan. Ano pa? Well, would you say you were influenced a lot by Nolledo? In fact, we're talking about cults, no? Yung cult, even the cover seems cultic to me, no? Ngayon ko lang, first time I saw yung di hamak na malaki yung pangalan ng author kaysa dun sa libro na, I liked it, no? I liked it. Parang kulto na yung Nolledo. Were you influenced, do you think, by Nolledo?
Yeah, could I just go back to that thing about the cult? I think it really does bother me because I think it's so important for us to read a book well and carefully and to see it for what it is. And all those received notions of cult or magic realism or nation, et cetera, a lot of times narrows our reading range. So we're not seeing the art of the book is so important for me. So in terms of your question about influence, I do hope that that it does become an influence on current Filipino writing. That's why publishing this book is important. It allows the ones who wish to write to extend the genealogy of their art. Here's another Filipino who is doing his own thing, and thus it expands our heritage, our concept of our art. There's a legacy out there. And for me, that was what was really important with Nolledo. When I read him as a kid and I realized, oh my God, this guy was doing this shit. I'd never really heard of him. And it was empowering just to see someone who was doing only, it seemed to me, only what he wanted to do, you know? So there was definitely for me a kind of optimism, a sense of confidence I gained from reading Nolledo, which is true for me of all the Filipino writers that I have read and loved, you know, Butch Dalisay, Franz Arsaliana, Estrella Alfon, Nick Joaquin, your own important work, Charlson, on the Chinese-Filipino experience. I'd say whenever I read a Filipino text that's moving me, that I find, wow, this person's doing this. I mean, it adds to my sense that I can also do the work. And so I think that's really important in terms of the influence of reading Nolledo when I was a kid. I'd say certainly reading Nolledo upped the ante. He is so gloriously himself bent on doing art on his own terms. And for a writer, that kind of centering on what you desire and need to do as an artist is so important to me. And so for me, that is influential, it's radical, it's pleasurable to see and read, and it is generative. You know, reading Nolledo is always generative. It makes me want to write. I'd say that as an artist. We are very different writers, of course. You know, I would say we don't write in similar ways, although I think the orality and the focus on syntax on the sentence is kind of very interesting for me with Nolledo. But you don't need to be similar to the writer to understand the power of his example. I do hope that the book, republishing the book, allows greater, that similar sense of expansion that I got as a child reading Nolledo.
How about your students in the US? Have you ever shared with them the book or yung works ni Nolledo and any reaction?
No,
See,
because
Nolledo was also in the US for some time, di ba?
yeah,
So I
no.
wonder kung may influensya sa mga Filipino Americans.
Right. I know he's read in the Filipino in literature classes. You know, that's actually, I was at a conference and this panel on modernist writing included a discussion of Nolledo. I teach high school. And I've taught Nick Joaquin, I've taught Rizal, but I have yet to teach Nolledo to my high school students. But I certainly taught other Filipinos. One of the reasons is it's actually still hard to get Nolledo in classes. He's the Dalkey Archive imprint is not as I would have to probably photocopy it.
Okay, so ngayon meron na. Ano pa? Anything? Well, Nolledo was a screenwriter, no? He wrote many screenplays, including yung Sunugin ng Samar, no? Which he wrote in Filipino, no? I assume. So, did you find it cinematic the way he writes the book itself? And can you imagine it as a movie, a cinematic version of this?
Can you hold a minute? My door, my door. I don't know why, but it's open.
Oh, nice view.
You're asking someone, Charlson, who doesn't do anything but write novels. You know, I don't do, someone once tried to get an said wanted permission to make an opera out of Insurrecto. And I said, sure, but don't ask me to goddamn read your opera, because an opera is different from a novel. A novel's elements and needs are different from the needs of opera. So you can do whatever you want with opera, you know, whatever. In terms of, I actually was not aware of him as a screenwriter, and I guess if Nolledo was writing a novel and also doing film, maybe you want to make a connection between them. I read Nolledo as a novelist, and I'm not the kind of reader that keeps. I like examining the novel's elements. Novel's desires. I like examining how he set up. I mean, his reading of Manila, his descriptions of Manila are so both very, very grounded in the moment, as well as you know, I imagine it was for him hugely nostalgic too, you know, just describing this old Manila. I'm very interested in the way the novelist elements here of point of view, the way he weaves different consciousnesses, highly subjective consciousnesses through a seemingly allegorical national framing. I'm very interested in the way he deals with time, because more or less his time is only a few days for this whole novel. And yet the contracted time in this novel, which is only a few days, moving into the Battle of Manila, I think it was August 1945. But it's also within a historical frame. He moves the novel. There's obviously the Spanish era, but also, for me, very interesting, given for this Filipino, for a Filipino novelist who was writing in America, his indictment of the United States imperialism by the end of this book, in a very, very, very beautiful way. So I see it, you can see, Charles, what I'm trying to say is I always think in terms of novel. For me, if a filmmaker was going to do something with Nolledo's book, they'd have to do it as a film and kind of disregard it as a novel. They'd have to figure out how the film would work. I mean, that's what I have done with anyone who says to me, I'd like to do a film of this, I'd like to do that. I say, do it. I don't really care. You know, you're a filmmaker. A filmmaker does what a filmmaker does. I write a novel. I do what a novel requires. So I imagine it's filmic in the sense that it's very physical, very very detailed in its descriptions. But I guess what I'm saying, for me, it's moot in terms of the art that it's doing.
Okay,
Yeah, I'm very annoying that way. I only do novels.
Yeah, I think now we have a question. Finally.
So I just wanted to, I mean, I guess my literary reading has been very impoverished because I haven't actually been able to read Nolledo, no? But I wanted to ask from both of Charlson and Gina, if you could, what are your favorite bits in the novel? And would you be able to share it with us? Like, if you could read a passage or two, and then maybe we could talk about it. I'd be very curious. What draws you?
I mean, I would even start just with how interesting the beginning is. But I'll just go to the beginning, because I like the whole novel, and the thing is, I like the novel's coherence. You know, the way all of these kind of disparate characters come together, and they're all pretty weird. They're completely, they're nutty, weird characters, but he puts it all together. So I'll just read the opening. But for the lovers. He was beginning to eat flowers, and the crescent moon was in his eyes when he awoke again. One night long ago, when they had intercepted a code from the enemy on the shortwave and had not needed him anymore, they pulled out their tents, mantled him with leaves, and left him. They left him a rifle, a booty basket, and a book of Psalms, for the major had decreed in defense of this murder. Let the little legionnaire lie here and die. It is written, it shall be read. But the boy went on sleeping and did not die, and when he awakened, it was to see. It was to find himself alone, a bird, a white-winged Maya dart in from the west, perhaps headed for the monsoon. Steadying the spring field, he cocked the hammer with a quivering thumb and waited. It flew away, whatever it was, and now he squinted up and remembered that it was the first time in a long spell he had seen the sky, and he thought, it is longer, lonelier, and lovelier than any of my prayers. He sighted the nimbus, an eagle in captivity, and fired. Lord, he said, I am punching holes in your garret. Glang, glang, glang. Is that a guitar somewhere? He asked aloud. It was not music, he heard, only himself. Days passed. So he puts us immediately in this space. He gives us what I feel is like that modernist poetry line. He was beginning to eat flowers. It's both lyrical as well as literal. You know, he was really eating flowers. So he puts us in that mode. You notice Buri Basket, you notice Maya. He's not going to be explaining those things to people. This is published in America. He's not going to explain Filipino words. He does this all the time. That's why I think it's so bold. It's so lovely, because he was doing the 70s before the whole thing of, you know, in the United States right now, where bringing in the languages of those whose languages seem to be outside the Colombo of American white supremacy is now being part of the literary landscape. But he was doing this a lot earlier. He was just putting Tagalog in there. And if you notice also, again, just in those few lines, you notice like the alliteration, you notice the orality, you know, the uses of what you call the and syntactical form, etc. He's very aware of poetic syntax. But if you think about just this opening, the setting is so very clear. You know, this forest clearing, the physicality of what the character is seeing is right there. What you have to do as a reader is hear it, you know, and in my view, what I was trying to say in my foreword, avoid as much as one can moving into like knee-jerk allegory and knee-jerk nationalism or knee-jerk, oh, what is the symbolism of this or that? See it for its physical moment. And I think it will be a lot of fun to think about even the forests of the Philippines that he's trying to talk about here, even the fact that there's a rifle, a buri basket, and a book of Psalms, you know, those are there physically. And it's kind of, and so to think about the physicality before the physicality and the imagination before even moving into allegory and symbolism.
Yeah. In fact, I think in the US edition, he told the publisher not to touch the Tagalog. Wag alisin yun. And I think no, yung generation nila, that started yung sila Greg Brillantes, for instance, also.
Yeah.
If you've read, I think maybe more, baka mas accessible than you've read the stories of Greg Brillantes, where he has this whole entire sentences in Tagalog. No? So obviously it's not for foreign reading. No, in that sense, it's for Filipinos.
I would say about, you know, with Greg Brillantes, not for foreign reading. I think it's for anyone's reading. And I think it's important for us to keep that in mind, that when we put our own languages in our books, it's for when we use Tagalog. I use a lot of Waray and La Tercera, for instance. Like I don't explain, I don't translate the Waray that I use in La Tercera that was just recently published last May. But it's when you put those, when we're doing that in our novels, we're also doing it for everyone. Because in my view, when Greg Brillantes is doing that, he's if someone who's not Filipino is reading Greg Brillantes, you have to move. It's your job to move into Greg Brillantes's world.
Okay,
You
so
know,
parang their generation, no, they started at Rolando Tino, no, with yung kanyang valediction sa Hillcrest, no, which English and Tagalog, no,
right.
and then in a way, yun nung naging Manila sound, no? Before it became before, you're younger, but now there was a generation who would not listen to Filipino music, or Filipino pop,
Would not listen.
or thought it was the class, di ba? Yung Baduy, until these things began happening first in literature, and then it went into pop culture, the hybrid, and then the Filipino music, OPM. So it's also related, in that, so ano pa?
Problema nila,
I think
problema nila yan kung isip nila Baduy yan.
yeah, but it's a generational thing. May panahon na ganon, di ba? Even movies, di ba? They were people who grew up not
Pero
watching
hindi ganon ngayon, no?
But I'm saying na yung generation na yan kasi that started, with all of this in the 60s and 70s of using mixing the languages and then slowly transitioning, some,
Right.
yung iba just started writing Filipino, hindi na nag-English. But yung tanong kanina, I think the title itself, I think that will give you a key to the book,
Right.
Bakit But for the Lovers, I think you should read the poem, and then if you've read the poem, then you would that is the key to the much of the book. It's from Dylan Thomas, in My Craft and Southern Art, and why. I think that's almost the manifesto of the novelist, of the author. Why he's even doing this. Yeah, so he picks up from Dylan Thomas.
But it is interesting because very clearly, so this is of a particular historical moment, the literary moment of Nolledo when he's doing this. So we're talking about, he's still within that, high modernism world, that Dylan Thomas and the modernist poets, even let's say Eliot, et cetera, so he's of that literary moment. But what's interesting for me about Nolledo is the way he moves beyond it, because that In My Craft or Southern Art, that kind of focus on the art for his art's sake world, or the world that and it's definitely in the novel, the world that valorizes art, the world that says art is really how we craft our art, and the independence and freedom with which we craft our art is so kind of important to that moment, so that you see what might be implied in that is, what about the political world? What about the social? What about the historical world? And for a long time, new criticism, which was what modernist poetry, the kind of criticism begotten by modernist poetry, which only wanted us to see craft, only wanted us to see how beauty was produced. It's also, in my view, exploded. I'm going to use the Exploding Galaxy thing, exploded by Nolledo, and that he actually was also adamantly moved into political critique, moved into historical reflection, moved into what I think is an important part for Filipinos to understand. What was World War II for us? What were the lies of imperialism, of American imperialism in World War II. And it's hard for us to see that it's hard for us sometimes to understand how it's precisely the power, precision, rigor of his craft that allows him to move into a powerful political and social critique of that historical moment. They're not what he does in But for the Lovers for Me, and the reason why I think I'm so glad that it's being republished, especially in our moment now where the political is really important. It's now being seen as part of the world of art. Definitely in America, that's happening. Is that it allows us, he's doing something beyond the modernist masters to which he alludes in the title. I mean, to be honest, Dylan Thomas also did some very interesting things, but the explicit conjoining of political critique with diabolically modernist art is fascinating for me.
Yeah, Contramundum, no? It also reminds me of Portrait of the Artist, yung destruction of Manila. And Len, you're
Oh, yes, thank you. I was going to raise this issue. You did talk about Brillantes and his use of Tagalog. It's not accessible to foreigners, but it does remind me of you see, Jane, I'm sure you're familiar with this in the US. Whenever, especially since we just had Juneteenth, and one line that Black BIPOC people always utter is, "We're not supposed to be the one explaining to you who we are.
Yeah.
We're not supposed to be one to educate you on why you're racist." And I think it's very potent that, to have reprinted a novel that kind of deals with, especially because, I was thinking about this. This is it's a diaspora novel in one sense, that he's living in a country where around that time, people largely forgot that America occupied the Philippines.
Well, people really don't think about that in America.
Yeah, if the people don't really think about it. And then, this is Daniel. There was a book about how America deliberately erased the fact that it was an imperialist power. And to this day, they still talk about, we're not imperialists. When like the very presence of millions of Filipinos in the United States kind of like shatters that illusion. And I wanted to ask in that case, how does it read for you as somebody in the diaspora? Because that's for us, it will be a different experience because it's just like a remembering of what Manila was like right just down the street is like where all these atrocities were happening. Right. So that's when I wanted to ask us about how you read it as a person a Filipino living overseas.
Right, you're right. Thank you for that question. Well, I grew up in the Philippines, so I grew up in Tacloban. I went to school in Diliman. So I do also have that reading of the very intimate reading of Manila that you're talking about, that one would have, because you know the ruins of Intramuros that were never reconstructed. A city bombed by its ally, the United States, and never reconstructed. So that I think that horror remains in Nolledo. I think it's profound in especially the novelists, the writers of. I read that horror in Niquaquin, for instance. I read that horror in Nolledo. So I, as a Filipino who grew up in the Philippines, I came to the States when I was in my 20s for grad school. I read it that way too. So I read it with that intimacy. I'll think about. I'll try and remember what it felt like to me to read it again for this forward. Having written already, I think I had just finished my 5th novel. I just finished La Tercera when I was doing this forward, and I'd already been no, so you're asking me who has written about the Philippine-American War in 2 books already, and I wrote about the Spanish War in Raimundo Mata, and I'm going through right now a book tour on the Italian translation of Raimundo Mata. So you're talking about someone who's done a lot of work on history, and for me, that is actually what really blew my mind. I completely had not seen in my earlier readings of the novel the historical critique, the really tight, elegant, and what you call this, complex lineage that he sets up through highly lyrical, crazy-making language and characters. He set it up within the artscape that he's doing. He sets up this powerful lineage between the devastation, the destruction of the city of Manila in World War II with the other Battle of Manila in 1899. And the way he does it is, I mean, you have to read the book to get that, because it's I think even though I'm telling you this right now, I think even when you get to that part, you will still be shocked. You'll still be surprised by how he does it. And for me, that was the new thing that I got, that as a child, as a young writer, I never really got his sense of history and how profoundly acute his critique was. And I think that maybe because I've been doing so much on the Filipino-American War. So that for me is what's new when I reread it.
Well, Nolledo was a boy, no, during the war, so he experienced all that. Siya yung batang scavenger, you know that. Anyway,
Hi, I'm Anthony from the National Book Development Board. My first question is for Mara. I wanted to know what was the process of getting the license and the rights for Nolledo to be published in the Philippines, and also Gina and Charlson talk about translation, cinematic adaptation, and audiobook. So were these rights, subsidiary rights, considered in the acquisition of rights for Nolledo's work? My second question is for Gina and Charlson. So we talk about lost Philippine fiction. So what 3 other fiction can you recommend that we need to be republishing for the younger generation?
I off the top of my head, ikaw, Gina, any?
At the top of my head, I know who I want. I know the person I want to see in print in a book that I will always have in my hands, and that is Estrella Alpon. She's a Cebuano writer. She is, some of her work for me is indelible. You know, Magnificence obviously is one, but even like there's a short story of her like sitting in a toilet seat, of a kid in a toilet seat and being seen by someone, by a boy, and what it means to be an upper class woman who is going after a poor boy who is, you know, the peeping Tom boy. I mean, I read that as a kid. She is fearless as a writer. She, you know, just talking about, you know, bare bottom women. I just think that, but she's not available, you know? And I would love to have Estrella Alpon short stories in print.
May UP Press ata, but I don't know how
I haven't seen
outsized
there
that
is one.
is.
I have a Giraffe Press collection of stories by Estrella Alpon, but you know, I imagine that there are a lot more that are out there because she published a lot. But you know how, you know, I have so many stories that I don't know where they are. I don't have copies of them anymore, like my own short stories. And so if there were a way to kind of find in the magazine archives, all of the ones that, yeah, so for me, Estrella. I love that writer. I also like Franz Arsaliana, and I don't know how published she is right now.
Okay, si ano, John L. Remil.
Good afternoon. No? So actually, I have so many things in my mind, but I'll go to Estrella Alfon first. No? So in 2000, when I was the production editor of the La Salle University Press, we published the complete works of Estrella Alfon. No? It came from the work of Herminia Bass. It's her dissertation at the La Salle University, Department of Literature. It's a bibliography study. No? So meaning it's she looked for all the versions of the short stories published and printed of Estrella Alfon, no? And she gathered this in, I think, 4 big boxes, no? And she has a dissertation, and I think it's available, no? And in the La Salle Library, no? And that collection was actually published by the La Salle University Press in 2000. So I
does
hope
it
it will be
include,
reprint.
does it
Yes.
include stories?
Yeah, all her stories include, except for fairy tale for the fairy tale for the cities. It's the short story where she was accused of, actually sentenced, so to be imprisoned for pornography. No, that story. Because I remember I asked the legal department of La Salle, no, if we can include that story in the collection. No, but there's a court ruling, no, that it cannot be published again. No, so yeah, perhaps
Shame on
NBDB
the
can do
court.
something about it. No, yeah, because it's part of the sentence. I think she was fined 15 pesos, no, and then and the story cannot be published anymore. No, but when I read the story, there's nothing pornographic about it. I mean, nothing. No, so I think that happened in 70s or 60s. No, anyway, another writer which I think, no, I would suggest to Exploding Galaxies to publish is Without Seeing the Dawn by Sivan Avellana. No, so I think it's out of print now. No, because I read that novel when I was in college a long time ago. I already lost my copy. No, but it's also about the World War II, no, Japanese occupation, but this is set in Iloilo, Without Seeing the Dawn. And actually, I came here today because I read on Facebook the first line, no, of this novel. No, he was beginning to eat flowers and crescent moon. So oh my God, I have to get a copy of the book. No, so and then because I also remember the opening of Without Seeing the Dawn. No, here the narrator is describing Carding, no, the main character, was a body as big as a house, no? So and then what I also noticed about our writers, yung mga generation ni na Nolledo, no? When they write about the World War II, the language is so beautiful, no? I also remember, that Without Seeing the Dawn, the same beautiful language, and also Hilda Cordero Fernando's A Wilderness of Sweet, no? So very lyrical language, no? Talking about war, no? So I don't know if kung merong significance yun, no? So yon, no? So I highly recommend Without Seeing the Dawn, no, to be reprinted, no? And about the idea, sorry as I've said, maraming ideas sa utak ko, no? Because of the conversation, no? Yung about that cult thing, no? So cult following, no? Because as a literature teacher, I think well, I think all the people in this room now are member of a cult, no, of reading Philippine literature, specifically Philippine literature in English, because I think the Filipino public is no longer a reading public, no? So, like for example, when I teach Philippine literature, I'm surprised that my students have not heard of Nick Joaquin or Bien Venido and Santos, because I thought everyone who's gone to high school have read at least May Day Eve, no, or The Day the Dancers Came, no. So I think that's also one problem that we should address. So I don't know if you have any suggestion, because the two of you are also professors of literature and writing. So anong gagawin natin, no, to make our students read again? Thank you.
Magtayo ng kulto, di ba? I'd love to be a cult. I don't know. See any.
Well, what I would say is the first thing I went where my mind went with that is, it's not the fault of the student who has not read Nick Joaquin, who does not know May Day Eve. I think it's a structural issue. I think it's an education issue. I think it's a political issue. I think it's a government issue. Shame on the government. Shame on the educational institutions that don't move the Filipinos to read the work of their own writers from the time they're little. You know, I grew up reading Philippine Journal of Education, you know, in a really backwards, you know, teeny tiny river town in Leyte, not even Tacloban, in my mom's hometown, Barugo in Leyte, very, very liblib na liblib talaga kasi mahirap yung town na yan kasi during the time of, let's say, the American occupation, wala nang mga people weren't riding the river anymore to get to the towns. There were roads, so there were no roads going to my mom's hometown. But that hometown, people had my aunt had Philippine Journal of Education. I would read the stories of Nick Joaquin there. And our and so many books were available to me. Martial law really changed the kinds of books that were offered to me, from reading the Victorian era poets and you know, English language poets, and Nick Joaquin. We ended up reading like stories about Aswang, and I don't know what happened with my English education, but I think it's not I think we need, I would always go to have generosity with the Filipino, who is the victim here. And they're not the ones who are perpetrating their own ignorance. It is the government that's doing that. It is the schools. And I think it's our job to have that generosity for the Filipino reader. To say the Filipino is not a reading public already puts us, puts the burden on that Filipino. The burden should be on the government. That should have a better educational system for all of us.
Okay. May tanong pa.
Hi, Gina. Hi, Charlson. I'm Carlo. I'm actually the editorial assistant for Exploding Galaxies. But in my free time, I'm an aspiring playwright. And I'm not a fictionist, but I do write in English. And Gina, going back to your preface, you mentioned how often art and polemic is sort of simplified into this binary that a work that sort of is more complex and more intricate is precluded from having political potential. And I was wondering, because as a writer in English and as someone who has been mentored by the likes of Anton Juan, who was an avant-garde playwright, I often feel condemned that, as you said about NVM Gonzalez, no, like the irony of writing in English, to deal with this irony of writing in a language that we inherited out of circumstance, I have to sort of resort to linguistic experimentation or stylistic experimentation to sort of just go around the need for, you know, because they say that writing in a colonial language, you don't get to express the reality of things, or that's usually the first critique. And I was wondering if you would have any advice bearing Nolledo in mind for young writers like me in English who sort of struggle with writing in this language. And yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Meron ka ba, Charlson, about
Well,
playwriting?
yeah, Nolledo was a playwright.
Ka ng play?
Ah?
Ikaw?
No, I'm saying, see, Nolledo himself was a playwright. Actually, he won so many awards for his plays in English, which I'm really interested in reading, no? Because I haven't read, I think maybe one, no? Yung meron siyang terrorist dialogues. But I haven't read most of his plays in English. I would like to read them, apropos that question, and maybe listen to them and see if they are stageable, let's say today, no? Where yung theater in English is no longer, well, it's still there, no? But a lot of plays now are mostly in Filipino. So yun, no? I don't know. Well, when kasi I did a movie version of Tanabata's Wife, you know, and by Sinay Hamada. And the first thing I decided is to use the source language, no? yung Ilocano, Kankanay, and Nihongo. No? That it cannot be done in English. No? So I don't know. As you say, it's a different medium, so you have to think in terms of that medium.
Yeah, again, that's what I was gonna say, kasi ano, I think the exigencies of novel writing would be different from playwriting, and I will say that as a person writing in English, I'm always wondering, I always ask myself, why am I writing in English? You know, why am I choosing this this language? And as you said, the historical moment where I went to school completely in English, and the only way that I read was in English, absolutely drives the choice of language that I do. More recently, with La Tercera, for instance, my last novel, because it was the form of the novel required a lot of going back to my mom's hometown. So much waray went into the novel. I mean, the New York Times reviewer for the novel mentioned, you know, that it's all about language, how to read, and the ways in which it seems unhomely for an American audience that doesn't understand the waray. And what I want to say is that, you know, even the Tagalogs will not understand the waray. They'd be annoyed too. But it might be homely. It might be a feeling of home for Filipinos who enter into the novel's language universe. So I would say, tungkol dyan sa playwriting, you know, you ask yourself why you're doing it in English. Does it make sense that is it important that the play, the drama, ang problema kasi sa drama, it's oral, eh. And so why is it in English? No, understand why it's in English. And depending on the need of the work of art, play with the languages that you have. That's what I've ended up doing with La Tercera. There was no way around it. I had to put waray in there, you know. There was no way that the novel, in my view, could work in my mind without the waray. So I put it in. But I didn't do it, for instance, with Gun Dealer's Daughter, because the perspective of the girl in Gun Dealer's Daughter was of an upper class, weird girl who was the daughter of gun dealers, whose world was already in English. So for her, the I perspective in Gun Dealer's Daughter required actually kind of a weird, almost an academic, poetic, lyrical English, because she was also having a nervous breakdown. So depending on the text, Insurrecto has a lot more Tagalog and waray than my other novels, because it moves into Balangiga, you know, Samar. So what I'm saying is the demands of the story, the demands of the characters could answer your question about when and how to use your multiple languages, and to always understand, in my view, that you center your need as a writer, as a Filipino, before all, you know, before all of the culto stuff that goes around the readership of novels. Because I think the act of writing the novel is very different from the readership that is part of novel writing. It's a part of novel. The reader is also part of the novel, but I think we need to always, as writers, kind of think about centering the demands of our art itself. Not to say you're not thinking about the reader when you're writing a play, you will be thinking about your audience. That's the difference between novel writing and playwriting. It's a direct relationship with the audience. The novel is very much mediated. So, but always center the demand of the art, not meaning your art for art's sake. I think you also think about the milieu of your characters, think about the political resonances, the ethical matters in the book, which are all part of art. I think centering their needs.
Okay, my question.
Hi, good morning or afternoon to you in Rome, Gina, and good afternoon to you, Charlson. I have a question. What do you believe is the benefit or even the power of writing something such as our history, our colonial past, our collective memory in language that is lyrical, in language that touches on magical realism? Because I just recall, like when I was in university, I had a lot of friends who were very frustrated reading texts, reading novels, short stories that discuss what should be something straightforward, what should be something factual in ways that are artistic, in ways that are even convoluted to them. So I'd like to understand from a writer's point of view, what do you think, why is it so important to be able to express express this part of our nationhood in ways that are not so straightforward, not so factual, or not even, I might venture, boring?
Anong sagot mo dyan, Charlson?
I don't know. Sometimes you're driven by the spirit of the language. I think the writer is also an artist. You're using material, just like a sculptor, you're molding clay. So as a writer, you are employing language in a way. You're molding language for your purposes, and sometimes it almost takes a life of its own. And when you read Nolledo, parang you sense that, no? There is the subconscious element, no? that comes, the dream, the dream element that comes into writing, of which you will not always have conscious control. You go back to it and look at it again, and all that stuff. But I think the language itself has power, and sometimes the work, the spirit of the work dictates, how it is to be written, how it wants to be written. And I think it's, if you do the work, then you sort of get into that. You understand maybe what I'm saying. It is the, of course, you have your architectonics, your construction, but in the end, it's a language. The language leads you to where it will take you. Might be not a straightforward answer, but that's as best as I can put it.
I absolutely agree with you, Charlson, there. I think there is, the recognition that what's interesting about the question too is that what you're saying is that you're very aware of the construction of the world, of, that historical world, because of the way it's being written, which I think is kind of interesting. Kind of an interesting experience. In terms of, so there is the writer's needs and impulses and desires in terms of how he or she or they approach language or approach the story. I would also say that is this particular Philippine fiction writing, there's, I think, the issue of layers and complexity, and in talking about Filipino reality, that I, as a writer, have found really the ground for the kinds of novels that I write, because It's very hard, like let's say with Nolledo, it's hard to see World War II without the Philippine-American War. It's kind of, we have to see the ways in which World War II was like an alibi for the white savior notion of America, so that we forget, you know, the fact that it was the same country that killed us in 1899. You know, and to imagine that the Filipino writers always dealing with the simultaneity of these forces, you know, automatically there's a layered way of reading anything. For me, as a Filipino writer, I just find it really hard to just have a singular way of looking at something, because our history is so goddamn complex, and so much of it is also forgotten. And so you have to move into the spaces of memory that also complicate the, let's say, if you're doing a contemporary moment. I find it difficult as a writer to have a singular frame. I really, really envy Jose Rizal. I envy so much Noli Me Tangere. I think what Rizal did with the Noli, that straightforward momentum of the one story of Crisostome Barra, and it just hits people. It just hits people in the solar plexus. I mean, it made people go to war. And that interesting kind of, and it wasn't a simple novel, because Noli Me Tangere was actually going against certain conventions of the 19th century novel. But notice what Rizal did after Noli. Very straightforward. Everyone got angry. When you read the Noli, you just get mad. You get angry at the Spaniards. He wrote Fili, El Filibusterismo, which is a lot more complex. It's a campus novel. It's a school novel. People are in school, you know, doing blah blah blah. And there are debates about, you know, language. There's a debate about how people should be educated. It becomes like a novel of ideas. You could see how Rizal wanted to complicate. He needed the complication, you know. When he was doing a second novel, it's almost like revising. He needed to recognize the complexity of revolt and revolution. It's even Rizal was doing it very early on when he was in his 20s, because of our colonial history.
Okay. Maybe one last ano na lang question. Okay. Last two.
Sorry. Hello, everyone. I'm Zeke. I'm also an artist, but I experiment in writing in some of my works. Then I'd like to touch on the gendered aspect that you did mention sa introduction. Kanina ko lang din binasa kasi I came in early sa venue. Tapos parang, anong gagawin ko? I'll try to purchase. And lo and behold, my received idea through reading the introduction is, it's an exciting novel that's to come, especially for our generation. Pero yeah, singit ko na yung question ko agad. You did mention about yung tendency to allegoricize the country or the image of Inang Bayan into like as the prostituted, you know, persona of the global imperialism, especially with since Spanish colonial and up to the Japanese and until ngayon, no, sa American period. What are the fault lines? What are the caveats or clumsiness na pinupuntahan kadalasan ng writers to have this certain readings, and why do you think it's reductionist, as to say? Tapos you were mentioning about like a lot of other writers who did give a detailed depiction of yung violence against women. And I find in particular yung milieu of yung novel na to really interesting kasi just imagining yung violence ng Japanese imperial army where spaces, brothels, and like rape areas were really institutionalized and structured. But you know, how do we read them as not reducing it, or what is the how fertile is the soil to create such an ethic na it's more than just talking about these things? The Philippines should be looked upon so much more, and yung papunta nga dun sa ethics that you mentioned. And I guess lastly is yung gendered aspect of the author as I'm not sure if it's queer or male, pero how does it convert yung parang male gaze into getting this type of male voice, this orality, this depiction, which then converts to an ethic that could be aspiring or liberatory. Thank you.
Yeah, salamat. Were you addressing me? Charlson, ikaw din.
Well, Charles can
Ikaw
also
yun, ikaw
answer.
The way I addressed it in the forward, I'm going to just, I don't know if anyone's read Neferti Tadyar. She was my classmate in the English department, and she is a scholar on, she writes about literature. And so she theorizes history and literature. And that whole thing about women, I really did have a problem with, and I still do. I think there are sexist moments, in my view, in the novel. And at the same time, again, for me, there are many, many different ways to take in novels. And when we hear sexism, when we hear a kind of thing, matters that are disturbing for us, I don't think we should push them under the rug. I think they're there, there's racism, obviously, in, like, let's say Mark Twain. There is misogyny in George Orwell, et cetera, et cetera. And you take in everything. If you don't include that reading, it's also problematic. But I will say, one of the things that I saw in the very disturbing ways that women were shown in the novel. And again, I'm sorry that this is going to be a received notion that people will have, but you may as well put it out there, because I do think that when we read the novel, we also have the individual right to think for ourselves, no matter what someone else is telling us. And I think we should always be that way as readers. Someone says this to us, how do we actually read it? I will also say that there's an ethic of reading that's really important, being open to the possibilities that are being set up for us in the book. And for me, it was interesting that there's a kind of weird power that women have. And I don't know if you'll agree with me. I'll just say that. I just think that there's a weird power that women have in Nolledo's book. There's a lot of queering as well. There's a lot of, even cross-dressing, even all of these different things that are happening. He's the gender issues there are so fast. So for me, I think we should check them out, read the book and see what it is. What is he doing? How contemporary, is his concept of sexuality and gender in the novel? I think it's interesting to see, and we don't need to. There are all these tropes, by the way, of this casual sexism. There are so many books that I can't teach anymore that I actually like, but the casual sexism, my students will kill me, So. But with this one, there is a way in which he deals with women that I think is really important. It's kind of interesting. Neferti says in Things Fall Away, she's theorizing historical experience as a tenet of revolutionary action. She says, this is the quote, "By historical experience, I do not mean only people's collective responses to the objective social and economic conditions in which they find themselves. I also mean the collective subjective practices they engage in that help to produce and remake these objective conditions." Now, it would seem that collective subjective practices might seem like an oxymoron. Well, in Philippine fiction, since Rizal, the simultaneity of the collective and the subjective in the novelist practices, it's constant. The most potent effect of it being that we extract the collective, the allegory, a lot of times, more readily than we see the subjective. What Neferti, I think, is trying to say here, because it's not necessarily an error to do that. I think it's also part of how we read, to read the collective history in the piece. But for me, as a novelist reading Nolledo and his powerful sense of the subjective within a collective historical frame, Nolledo's characters are best traced through their consciousnesses, moving within their precisely drawn geographies, urban, rural, etc., their specific historical experience before being abstract symbols of nation. In that way, we can redeem Alma, for instance, from the allegorical traps of rape and race, instead following her urgent transforming acts of survival. She's a beautiful character of survival. I mean, she remains an enigma to me. It's she exists emphatically in her world and in some mysterious way never dies, like a Filipino Like all of us with mothers, the woman never dies. She's always physical, not just soul, always her curious, exploring, discovering self, breathing. And that for me is true of all of Nolledo's characters. They exist as their own selves, subjectivities, not just tropes of history. I also agree with Glenn Diaz that he had a beautiful reading of the novel, the great contemporary Filipino novelist Glenn, who wrote in his essay, he noted that it's certainly hard to separate nation or symbolism from Nolledo's characters because Nolledo himself gives them all the tropes of nation and symbolism that readers expect of a novel that deals with Philippine history. But at the same time, I would advocate for a reading of that subjective frame, which how he creates subjectivity and a grounded place for all of his characters, give him credit for doing both at the same time, symbolism and subjectivity both at once. Always have that multiplicity, simultaneity, layered complexity, and also examining oneself as a reader. Why do I read this way? Why do I move into allegory? What is it? Why do I, if one is not seeing the subjective, what, because it's there, it's highly individual, the characters. Think about yourself as a reader and how you're taking something in, and reflect on yourself. And why is it that you want a straightforward narrative? What is it about your framing? What is it about your education, your milieu that would like something simpler, or would like something, would like to move into, would like to not have allegory? I had to do that myself because I resisted the concept of allegory for a long time because it was taught to me at school. Allegory and symbolism was how things were taught. And I always thought that was often simplistic. But I also had to examine myself about what it was about me as a reader that made me who I am, and include that reflexivity in the complexity of ways of reading that I demand of myself, I demand of my students, and so on.
Yeah. I think we've run out of time.
Thank you, Gina and Charlson. We began with the idea of the cult, and we dismantled that, hopefully. Or even if we have not, we now come to an understanding of how to look at that idea of cult in terms of our reading of literature. And we have been given ways to look at particularly Nolledo's book, But for the Lovers. We have been given information of the text and those outside, but for this reason, we'd like to invite you to go on your own journey with the book and discover it. We also have another talk on July 28th, also on the same book. So we are opening more and more avenues of reading the book. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and thank you, Gina and Charles.
Thank you very much.
We'd like to call on Dawn to talk more about the book.
Hello, hi, I'm Don. I'm the editor of Exploding Galaxies. So thank you very much. But grabe, ang ganda ng reading nila, Gina and Charlson. Parang I feel like I don't have much to say. But I feel like But for the Lovers is a perfect way to introduce our press because it's such a kick in the door, the way it grabs you as a reader and the way that the novel is practically out of circulation here in the Philippines. And I love that Mara really pushed for circulating it here in the Philippines. So now it's here. Hindi nyo na kailangan mag-Amazon or, well, mag-RIP book depository just to get the novel or have it photocopied. I've seen people tell stories that they were photocopying the novel because it was required reading in their school. So here it is. And there it's discounted. With the Philippine edition of But for the Lovers, Exploding Galaxies is clear in what kind of works that we want to publish. We want great works that haven't had much time in circulation here in the country. And also we've noted your suggestions of what to publish. We are out there digging crates, digging magazines to look for great Philippine fiction. And also not just in English, but also in Filipino maybe translated work people have been submitting to us. So we are out there, and don't worry, we will publish more in the future. We are very honored to have this novel supervised by Mrs. Nolledo and the Nolledo family. So this edition is as great as it is because of their input of what they wanted to do with this edition of the novel. We hope that putting it back on the bookshelves will make people want to read not just more Philippine fiction that's been out of print, but more of Nolledo. A lot of his, I think his short story by UST has been long out of print, so maybe they'll be enticed to publish it now that his novel is here in the Philippines. So any novels or works of fiction that have fallen through the cracks, we hope that we might see it more, not just by Exploding Galaxies, but a lot of the Philippine publishers who are very active in revitalizing classics by Philippine authors. And don't worry, there are Philippine readers. Philippine readers are very, very active. If you've seen them in the cons, grabe, amazing how they follow authors. They might not read Joaquin or sino pa ba? Fernando, well, because she's been so long out of print, but they read contemporary Filipino authors, and grabe, the lines just for book signing. They are very recipient of new Philippine fiction. So don't worry, there are Filipino readers, and we are very, very thankful for them. And tama yung sinabi ni Gina, we should be generous to Filipino readers. So thank you, thank you.